Hi, my name's Pamela Snow. I'm a professor at Trobe University in Bendigo in central Victoria. Well, I sometimes say that my research works two ends off against the same middle. I've done a lot of research over the last 20 years on young people in the youth justice system, young people in out-of-home care, young people who have moved out of mainstream education into flexible alternative education settings because they're not coping in the mainstream. And in many cases, these young people are not three separate groups. They're the one group who intersect with all service sectors, unfortunately. And what that research has shown is, not surprisingly, but nevertheless alarmingly, high levels of unidentified oral language difficulties and high rates of very low literacy. And it's those issues that really got me interested in what was happening in the earlier years of school and got me asking, how is it that children who are in many cases starting from behind with respect to disadvantage, psychosocial disadvantage, economic disadvantage, living in poor communities, perhaps more crime-prone communities, why are these children in many cases in what's been described as a school-to-prison pipeline, which is a really unfortunate term. So that got me interested in looking at early reading instruction, because it was quite obvious to me, looking at the literature on the adult justice system, for example, that adult prisons are full of people who can't read. If you want to find a large population in one place of people with low literacy, the best place to go to is an adult prison. So that got me thinking about what's happening upstream in early years education. And of course, what I unwittingly and unknowingly walked into is the reading wars, which I had some knowledge of, but I had no idea that the knowledge translation crisis was as bad as it actually is with respect to how best to teach all children how to learn to read in their early years of school. We should have an expectation that 95% plus children learn how to read. We should be assuming that only a very small percentage of children are going to struggle for intrinsic, if you like, neurobiological reasons and require additional supports. In fact, we're looking at 30 to 40% of students who don't successfully meet minimum benchmarks with respect to literacy. And they are often, or overwhelmingly, students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So, and surprise, surprise, who ends up in the criminal justice system? Overwhelmingly people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So for me, making the transition to literacy, and by that I mean reading, writing and spelling, so it has a very specific meaning for me, literacy, in the first 3 years of school has profound importance as a determinant of health across the lifespan. It's profoundly important for getting children positioned to deal with the Year 4 curriculum. Where you get to in Year 3 is obviously important for the next curriculum step, but it also casts a very long shadow, for better or worse, across the entire lifespan. It's a public health issue. It's a determinant of health, and we live in an economy, in a society, first world industrialised nation, in which jobs for uneducated workers are disappearing. So if you can't transition from secondary school into further training of some sort, whether that's TAFE, the vet sector or higher education, then you are going to be on the social and economic margins for the rest of your life, and you're going to cost the taxpayer a lot of money. Look, I think that's a good question, the question about what education departments should require of schools in their jurisdiction, and I will try to answer that question, but I think there's a slightly more upstream question, which is how we prepare teachers in their pre-service education. Because in a sense, it wouldn't matter how much, how empowered and focused we made our policy divisions in the departments of education tomorrow to get in the driver's seat and put both hands on the steering wheel and say, okay, we're going to make changes, they're making changes with an ill-prepared teaching workforce, and that's because the workforce has not been adequately prepared through their pre-service education at universities. So we know that teachers, if you take reading as an example, there is a vast amount of international research, a lot of it's been done in Australia, that shows that teachers have very poor knowledge about language and linguistics. Learning how to read is a linguistic activity. Teachers need to know how language works under the bonnet, metaphorically speaking. So they need to know about things like phonemes and morphemes and syllables and voiced and unvoiced consonants. They need to know about digraphs and trigraphs and schwa vowels. This is kind of 101 linguistics that's incredibly important if we're going to have teachers who have an explicit knowledge of the process of reading, and they can work with novices to get them across the bridge to be independent, skilled readers. So I'm not overly optimistic about how much change we could affect in a short period of time if we got the minds of our education bureaucrats focused around this, because they still have to deal with what they have with respect to the teaching workforce. And I emphasise that this is not a criticism of teachers. I think teachers have had their family china stolen from them because this is core knowledge that belongs to teachers. If you walk into a school, the most knowledgeable person in a school about reading, how to teach reading, how to identify and support struggling readers should be a teacher. That is not currently the case. Teachers constantly tell us that they don't feel confident in how to teach reading, how to identify accurately struggling readers, and how to appropriately support those struggling readers. Now, other professions, such as speech pathology and educational and developmental psychology, have looked at the body of knowledge that education faculties have discarded. They've metaphorically put it out on the nature strip with a sign on it saying, please take, we don't want it anymore. Other disciplines have come along and taken that knowledge, and so now we have a tricky situation in many schools where the most knowledgeable person about how to teach reading is not necessarily a teacher. And I think education faculties have a lot to answer for in that regard. They have taken the knowledge and skill set that rightfully belongs to teachers, and they've replaced it with something that is not fit for purpose. That's a good question. The question of how do teachers backfill deficits in their own knowledge. I've worked with a number of teachers who've had their own epiphanies, been tearing their hair out, looking at students who, for all intents and purposes, they can see should be learning how to read and are not, and have done their own research. And I guess the internet's been a great boon in that regard, because they can go home and Google and find that another whole world of cognitive science exists out there that they knew nothing about. But teachers shouldn't have to have their own epiphanies and spend thousands of dollars of their own money on their own professional development and conferences, and then trying to push against a tide of resistance in many cases within their schools, working with their literacy leaders, literacy coordinators, principals. This is really crusading work that many teachers take on, and it requires enormous courage and conviction, and can be extraordinarily lonely, and their work can in many cases be undermined and to some extent undone by other teachers who are not following on from their good work perhaps in the early years. Then the child progresses, those students progress to another class where a completely different pedagogical approach is being used, and particularly the children in the tail of the curve will be disadvantaged by that lack of robustness in early instruction. One of the biggest levers that we have to address the fact that being able to read is a social justice issue is the level of preparation of our teaching workforce. but we need to have again, going back one level, we need to have an academic education workforce in universities that understand the cognitive science on learning how to read and avail themselves of that knowledge, but also share it with their students. If you asked a pre-service teacher or a new graduate teacher, tell me about the theories of how children learn to read that you learnt about at university, I will bet they can't name a theory of how children learnt to read. I think one of the big problems that we have here is, and I'm making a generalisation, I know that, but education academics don't seem to have a strong level of engagement with research that is done outside faculties of education. So a lot of the really robust research that's been done on how children learn to read and how to support struggling readers in the last 20 years, for example, has been done in the cognitive science, cognitive psychology fields. I don't know why, but there seems to be some resistance. There are paradigm differences in how different researchers ask questions and what kind of research methodologies that they use. And there is a resistance in many faculties of education to looking at research that they consider to be out of paradigm. So education has become closed shop when it comes to looking at where they will source evidence. Now, if we applied that in medicine, that would mean that research from pharmacology, from biochemistry, from microbiology, from the social sciences was considered not relevant or not as good because it wasn't done by medical practitioners. Medical practitioners at the bedside regularly use research that was generated by people in other disciplines. They don't say to the microbiologist, you're not at the bedside responsible for the care of this unique individual. What would you know? Why should I listen to what you say? That thinking sometimes, unfortunately, applies in teaching. That the teacher is the only person who can be an expert in what goes on in the classroom. And I think that thinking needs to change. There's a lot of really robust research that's come out of cognitive psychology in the last 20 years. Theories that tell us about optimal ways to promote learning. Cognitive load theory is one of those, the idea that we need to think about learning from the perspective of the novice. We need to understand in terms of information processing that everybody has a working memory system that is fragile. Children have a particularly fragile working memory system, and nothing goes into long-term memory unless it can get past the speed hump of working memory. Now, when I've introduced this model to practicing teachers, and you know the irony is there straight away that I'm introducing it to practicing teachers. They haven't heard of it before. They haven't heard about information processing, about working memory, about cognitive load. They generally embrace it with great enthusiasm and say it makes an enormous amount of sense. So that's just one example of a very clear and robustly tested theoretical framework that has got an abundant number of implications for how the everyday classroom should be organised, from everything from seating arrangement in relation to what the activity is. So for some activities, having children sitting in circles facing each other is appropriate. For other activities where you might be introducing a new concept for the first time and wanting all children to focus their attention on worked examples, it probably makes more sense in terms of fragile attention systems to minimise the load of distractions and maximise the opportunities for all children to be able to focus their attention.